Thank you. That was a very systemic evaluation of what's happening in China right now. So let me ask the second question, which is about US policy toward China these days. So we see some mood of reconciliation or dialogue, as you touched upon, between US and China since the Bali summit meeting last November. So after the balloon incident, we see some downside of the relationship right now. But what is your view on the prospect of the cooperation in the future between US and China? And how much do you think the recent balloon incident has damaged the US trust toward China?
Institutionally, and in terms of the political cycles of both the United States and China, we should have begun to see a more constructive approach to our many areas of friction and conflict after November. We all knew that Party Congress in October preoccupy the Chinese, and they would not be reaching out diplomatically until after that. And we also know, and maybe your viewers will learn, that the United States is hosting the APEC Leaders Forum next November in San Francisco. So if you're taking a medium range view of how to handle relations with the major powers, you'd want to set in motion November this past year the kinds of structures and meetings that will help you get to successful hosting of Xi Jinping in the United States in November 2023. And that's what they seem to have set about to do when at Bali, President Xi Jinping and President Biden agreed to have their policy leaders, especially the foreign minister and the secretary of state, meet after the party congress and then begin the process of putting some boundaries and some controls. The Americans like to say some guardrails on the system. That's why the balloon incident, while itself not particularly significant, symbolically was a huge negative for US-China relations. It unleashed passions on both the American and Chinese popular sides. Politicians on both parties can agree on not much else, but their common hostility toward China in the US. And the Chinese side has begun to be very stressed and unhappy, and well, I'll get to some more in a minute. So we didn't get the launch for the year of constructive diplomacy that I think both had in mind. From Xi Jinping's point of view, as reinforced leader with a new set of officials all closer to him than before, he was in a position to start a diplomatic outreach. And we know that over the last weekend, they made an unusual, unprecedented foray into bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together in Beijing. This is a serious and important event. We now are getting reports that Xi will soon be flying to Moscow to meet with Putin, and he will conduct a virtual meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. There again, there's potential for China to pose as a peacemaker or to try to improve its position in the diplomacy surrounding these hot issues, the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia. And I assume he'll have some agenda for Asia as well, perhaps the Korean Peninsula. But we haven't seen that yet. On the American side, Biden had a pretty good first 2 years. He rebuilt, and we were lucky in Korean politics, cooperated with relations with Korea after the damage done in the Trump era. He rebuilt relations with Japan. The Quad has been taking shape. It's not a finished NATO-like instrument, but it's something that wasn't there before, and it has significance in limiting the kind of influence and assertiveness that China has been using in Asia Pacific generally. The US and Australia and Britain have formed the AUKUS agreement, which is another significant milestone. And at home, Biden has had money to deal with rebuilding America's semiconductor and other capabilities and infrastructure. So he could have said at the end of November, beginning of this year, that I'm back, America is back, we've got ourselves ready, we want a deal too. So you, Xi Jinping, want to reach out and stabilize relations with the U.S. while China reaches out to the Middle East and Southeast Asia, South Asia, and maybe Northeast Asia. And the U.S. should be prepared to deal with that. We strengthened at home and abroad. And yet we got distracted by this balloon. It became a matter of kind of hysteria. We've now had a new special committee of Congress on China, which has conducted hearings of the likes of which we haven't seen since the early 1950s with the McCarthy period, where no positive word can be said, only one speech after another denouncing China takes place. How you rebuild in this atmosphere is very hard to see. I think it's possible for the reasons I mentioned, that Xi Jinping is structurally in a better position. Biden is structurally in a better position. They need to re-engage in diplomacy and use this year ahead till November. I don't see it yet. I'm somewhat pessimistic on the American side that the personalities are not there to take the lead. On the Chinese side, we don't know. They're new people. Wang Yi, we know sort of well, but Qin Gang, the new foreign minister, what influence he'll have, we have yet to study that and see in practice what's going to happen. But this is a year ahead that's going to be very challenging. I think, I would hope that we would reach inside ourselves for capabilities to say, okay, we may be angry about this or that subject, but let's get together and do business. Let's get the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Treasury, the eventually Defense Secretary and his counterpart to meet and talk and to try to find areas where they can do things together, or at least demark areas where we won't do damage to each other. And of course, the Taiwan issue boils along. Taiwan is going to have presidential elections early next year. And between now and then, their political life is going to get very excitable. And they're not going to be focused on international relations. They're going to be focused on winning the domestic fight inside Taiwan, which means that's the Beijing, US, Taipei, Beijing, Washington, Taipei triangle will become more unstable at the Taiwan corner of the triangle. And we should be taking not preemptive, but preparatory measures to try to make sure that we don't have the eruptions of domestic politics lead to conflicts in international affairs. When Beijing turns to Northeast Asia, it will be to try to do two things. One, to intimidate South Korea, and at the same time to entice South Korea. And you had this before with the installation of the THAAD missiles, and then the reaction to that in the commercial sphere, the decline of tourism, damage to Korean industries and commercial businesses in China. And I wouldn't rule that out for the future. China and Russia both have grown closer to North Korea. And I think the kind of cooperation we had over the previous couple of decades from time to time with UN Security Council resolutions to sanction and limit North Korea will not be available to us. North Korea, one hopes, will be still viewed in Beijing as more potential for trouble than for cooperation and contribution to Chinese interests. But if China calculates that a troublesome North Korea is more in its interest, we're all going to be sorry to see that happen. We have to hope that China wants to maintain as much stability in Northeast Asia as possible, so that it will have an incentive to put effective constraints on North Korea. But we're not moving in that direction yet. I would just speculate, as I did earlier. Right. Given that he's looking elsewhere, it won't be long before they'll realize there are probably tools they can deploy in East Asia and Northeast Asia to advance a more pro-China agenda in the next few months.